Elite high school teachers laughed at the homeless man teaching a black boy math in the streets. When they discovered his real identity, the entire school fell silent. The dumpster behind Giovanni's Italian restaurant stank of rotten tomatoes and moldy bread. Jordan's stomach growled as he lifted the heavy metal lid, his skinny 11-year-old arms shaking with the effort. The setting sun cast long shadows in the alley, and the autumn wind cut through his thin t-shirt. "Come on, please," he whispered, standing on his tiptoes to peer inside. "Just one good box." His fingers trembled as he pushed aside soggy cardboard and wilted lettuce. There, a half-eaten container of pasta, still warm. Jordan grabbed it, nearly dropping the container in his haste. He crouched behind the dumpster and shoveled the cold spaghetti into his mouth with his fingers. The back door of the restaurant creaked open. Jordan froze, sauce dripping down his chin. "Hey, get out of here, kid." A cook in a white apron waved a dish rag at him. "Shoo, before I call the cops." Jordan stuffed the container into his small backpack and ran. His worn sneakers slapped against the wet pavement as he darted between buildings, heart pounding. He didn't stop until he reached the next block, ducking into a narrow space between a laundromat and a boarded-up convenience store. The memory hit him like a punch to the gut. 1 week ago, the screaming. His parents' faces twisted with anger. "I can't do this anymore." His mother had grabbed her purse, mascara streaking down her cheeks. "I'm done." "Fine. Leave in." His father had shouted back. "See if I care." The door had slammed so hard the windows rattled. Jordan had hidden in his room, hands pressed over his ears. When he woke up the next morning, they were both gone. No note, no explanation, just empty rooms and silence. He'd waited 3 days, eating the last of the cereal and peanut butter. On the 4th day, the landlord had found him. "Where are your parents, boy?" Jordan had run then, too. Now he huddled deeper into his corner as voices echoed down the alley. A group of teenagers swaggered past, passing a bottle and a paper bag between them. "Yo, check it out." One of them pointed at Jordan. "Little man thinks he's invisible." Jordan grabbed his backpack and bolted. Their laughter chased him as he sprinted down the block, looking for somewhere safer. He found another alley, darker and narrower than the first. His chest burned as he squeezed between a stack of pallets and the brick wall. When his breathing steadied, Jordan poked his head out. The street was quieter here. A police car rolled past, its lights off. Jordan stepped out, waving his arms, "Help, please." The car didn't slow down. Jordan's arms dropped. His eyes burned, but he blinked hard. Crying wouldn't help. Nothing helped. As he turned back toward his hiding spot, movement caught his eye. An old man with a white beard sat on a milk crate near the mouth of the alley, watching him. The man's clothes were ragged, but his eyes were sharp and clear. Jordan ducked back behind the pallets. He pulled his backpack close to his chest and curled into a tight ball. His stomach churned around the stolen pasta. The cement was cold through his jeans, but at least the pallets blocked most of the wind. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine he was back in his bed. The real one, with his Pokemon sheets and the nightlight his mom had bought him when he was scared of the dark. But the fantasy crumbled as quickly as it formed. The old man was still there when Jordan opened his eyes. He hadn't moved from his milk crate, but now he was writing something in the dirt with a piece of chalk. Jordan's eyelids grew heavy. He fought to stay awake, but exhaustion dragged him down. His last thought before sleep took him was that he should find a better spot tomorrow. Somewhere warmer. Somewhere safer. But for now, his backpack clutched tight against his chest. It was all he had. The night grew colder around him. In his fitful sleep, Jordan didn't notice the old man drawing closer, or the worn blanket that was gently draped over his shoulders. He didn't see the sad smile on the weathered face, or hear the soft words spoken into the darkness. "Sleep well, young man. Tomorrow's another day." The smell of fresh bread pulled Jordan from his sleep. His eyes snapped open, body tensing as he remembered where he was. The blanket slipped from his shoulders. He didn't remember having a blanket. "Hungry?" Jordan jerked back, hitting his head against the brick wall. The old man from last night crouched a few feet away, holding out half a loaf of bread. Steam still rose from the torn crust. "It's okay," the man said. His voice was quiet, like he was talking to a scared cat. Take it? Jordan's stomach clenched at the sight of fresh bread, but he shook his head. Don't want it? Suit yourself. The old man set the bread on a clean piece of cardboard between them. But it's from the bakery next door. They throw out the day-old stuff. Perfectly good bread, just not fresh enough for paying customers. The bread sat there, tempting him. Jordan's mouth watered, but he stayed pressed against the wall. The old man didn't move closer, just settled onto his milk crate and pulled something from his coat pocket. Yesterday's newspaper, crumpled but readable. Minutes ticked by. The bread cooled. Jordan's stomach growled loud enough to echo off the walls. My name is James, the old man said without looking up from his paper. You can call me Mr. James if you like. Most people around here do. Jordan didn't respond. He watched Mr. James turn a page, squinting at the tiny print. Without thinking, Jordan leaned forward slightly, trying to make out the headlines. You can read? Jordan startled at the question. Yeah, I'm not stupid. Never said you were. Mr. James folded the paper carefully. What grade were you in? Before. Fifth, Jordan mumbled, then bit his lip. He hadn't meant to answer. Good age for math. You like math? Jordan shrugged. His last math test was still in his backpack, crumpled at the bottom. A big red D scratched across the top. Mr. James reached into his pocket again and pulled out a piece of chalk. Without a word, he began drawing numbers on the smooth concrete beside him. What are you doing? Jordan asked before he could stop himself. Just solving some problems. Mr. James scratched out an equation. Sometimes it helps me think. Jordan watched the chalk move. The numbers were neat, precise. Not like his own messy scrawl. That's wrong, he blurted as Mr. James finished an equation. Oh. Mr. James raised his bushy, white eyebrows. How so? 7 times 8 isn't 54. It's 56. A smile crinkled the corners of Mr. James's eyes. So it is? Would you like to show me the right way? Jordan hesitated. His stomach growled again, louder this time. Maybe after some breakfast? Mr. James nudged the bread closer with his foot. Slowly, watching Mr. James for any sudden moves, Jordan reached for the bread. It was still slightly warm. He tore off a small piece and sniffed it before taking a tiny bite. Good, isn't it? Mr. James went back to his equations. Now, about that multiplication. The next hour passed in a blur of chalk dust and numbers. Jordan found himself sitting cross-legged on the concrete, the empty bread wrapper beside him, correcting Mr. James's mistakes with growing confidence. Then a police siren wailed nearby. Jordan grabbed his backpack and ran without thinking, darting deeper into the maze of alleys. His heart pounded as he ran, not stopping until the sound of chalk on concrete was far behind him. He finally slowed in an unfamiliar alley, breathing hard. His backpack felt lighter. Jordan's stomach dropped as he realized he'd left it back there. The backpack with his last pictures of his parents, his Pokemon cards, everything he had left. No, he whispered, spinning in a circle. Which way had he come? The buildings all looked the same. Hours passed as he wandered, trying to find his way back. The sun climbed higher, then began to sink. His feet ached in his worn sneakers. Finally, as shadows lengthened across the pavement, he slumped against a wall and slid to the ground. Looking for this? Jordan's head snapped up. Mr. James stood at the end of the alley, holding Jordan's battered backpack. Found it after you ran? Mr. James walked closer, movements slow and careful. Kept it safe for you. Jordan stared at the backpack, then at Mr. James. Why? Because everyone needs something that's theirs. Mr. James set the backpack down between them. And everyone deserves a chance to learn. He pulled out his chalk again and knelt on the concrete. Now, shall we try those times tables again? Jordan looked at his backpack, at the chalk in Mr. James's weathered hand, at the gentle smile on the old man's face. Slowly, he scooted forward. 7 times 8 is 56, he said quietly. So, it is. Mr. James began to draw numbers. So it is. The sound of chalk scratching against concrete filled the alley as the sun set behind the buildings. For the first time in days, Jordan didn't feel quite so alone. Look at this garbage. Old man playing teacher with a street rat. The harsh laugh made Jordan's chalk snap against the concrete. 3 men in ragged clothes stood at the entrance of the alley. passing a bottle between them. "Ain't that sweet?" Another one sneered. "Teaching multiplication to a kid who'll be dead or in jail before he hits high school." Jordan's face burned. He dropped the chalk and grabbed his backpack, ready to run. "That's enough." Mr. James's voice was quiet but firm. He didn't look up from the math problem they'd been working on. "Move along." "Or what, Professor?" The first man staggered forward. "Gonna give us detention?" "No." Mr. James finally looked up. Something in his eyes made the man step back. "But I will remind you that Officer Martinez patrols this block in about 5 minutes. He's not as understanding as I am about public intoxication." The men muttered but shuffled away. Jordan stayed frozen, backpack clutched to his chest. "I should go," he whispered. "This is stupid anyway." "Why is it stupid?" Mr. James picked up the broken chalk. "Because—" Jordan's voice cracked. "They're right. I'm just some homeless kid. What's the point of learning math?" "The point?" Mr. James drew a perfect circle on the concrete. "The point is that your circumstances don't define your capabilities." "What does that even mean?" "It means," Mr. James said, starting another equation, "that I used to teach calculus at Columbia University." Jordan stared at him. "You're lying." "No." A shadow passed over Mr. James's face. "I'm not." Thunder rumbled overhead. Both of them looked up at dark clouds gathering above the buildings. "Storm's coming," Mr. James said. "We should find shelter." Fat raindrops began to fall as they gathered their few possessions. Mr. James led them 3 blocks to an abandoned storefront with a deep doorway. They huddled under the overhang as the rain turned into a downpour. "What happened?" Jordan asked after a long silence. "If you were really a professor." "Life happened." Mr. James pulled his thin jacket tighter. "My wife and daughter were driving to meet me for dinner. A drunk driver ran a red light." Jordan's throat tightened. "Oh." "I stopped going to work, stopped paying bills, stopped caring." Mr. James's voice was distant. "By the time I started caring again, there was nowhere to go back to." Lightning flashed, followed by a crash of thunder that made Jordan jump. The wind drove rain under their shelter, soaking their shoes. "My parents just left," Jordan whispered. He hadn't told anyone yet. They were fighting, and then they were gone. Didn't even say goodbye. Mr. James nodded slowly. "That must hurt terribly." The simple words broke something in Jordan's chest. He pressed his face into his knees, shoulders shaking. Mr. James didn't try to touch him or offer empty comfort. He just kept watch as the storm raged around them. Jordan's exhaustion eventually pulled him into an uneasy sleep. In his dreams, he was back home, but all the rooms were empty. He called for his parents, his voice echoing off bare walls. He ran from room to room, but there was no one there, no one anywhere. "Jordan?" A gentle voice pulled him from the nightmare. "You're safe. It's just a dream." He blinked in the gray pre-dawn light. His head rested against Mr. James's shoulder, the old man's jacket draped over both of them. "Sorry," Jordan mumbled, sitting up quickly. "Nothing to be sorry for." Mr. James stretched his stiff legs. "Everyone needs rest." They surveyed their shelter as the sun rose. The rain had soaked through most of their belongings. Jordan's backpack was damp, and Mr. James's newspaper had dissolved into pulp. "The chalk probably survived," Mr. James said, checking his pockets. "We could continue our lesson if you'd like." Jordan looked at their wet clothes, their meager possessions, the puddles reflecting the morning light. He should leave, find a better spot, look for food. A dozen reasons to go. Instead, he said, "Can you show me fractions again? I didn't really get them before." Mr. James smiled and pulled out the chalk. "Of course. You see, when we talk about fractions, we're really talking about parts of a whole." As the city woke up around them, chalk scratched against drying concrete. Jordan watched the numbers take shape under Mr. James's steady hand. And for the first time since his parents left, he felt something like hope. 6 times 7 is... Jordan hesitated, watching Mr. James's face for clues. "Don't look at me," Mr. James said. "Look at the numbers." A harsh cough interrupted Jordan's concentration. Mr. James doubled over, his whole body shaking with the force of it. The chalk fell from his trembling fingers. "Mr. James?" Jordan reached for him, then pulled back, unsure what to do. I'm fine, Mr. James wheezed, waving off Jordan's concern. Just a cold? But it wasn't fine. Jordan could see Mr. James's hands shaking as he picked up the chalk. His skin looked grayer than usual, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. Maybe we should stop for today, Jordan said. Nonsense. Mr. James straightened up with visible effort. Now, 6 times 7 is 42, Jordan answered automatically, still watching Mr. James's trembling hands. But you're sick. Everyone gets sick sometimes. Another cough racked his body. The important thing is to keep going. You need a doctor. Mr. James laughed, but it turned into another coughing fit. Doctors cost money, son. Now 6 times 8 is... Before Jordan could answer, shadows fell across their makeshift classroom. Well, look who it is. The voice made Jordan's stomach clench. The professor and his pet. 3 teenagers blocked the alley entrance. Jordan recognized them from before, the ones who'd chased him that first night. The leader, a tall kid with a red bandana, stepped forward. Teaching time's over, old man. He kicked at their chalk drawings. This is our spot now. Mr. James stood slowly, positioning himself between Jordan and the teenagers. There's plenty of room for everyone. That's not how it works. Red Bandana pulled something from his pocket. The flash of metal made Jordan's heart stop. Give us whatever you got, and maybe we'll let you walk away. Run, Jordan, Mr. James said quietly. What? Now? Jordan bolted toward the back of the alley. Behind him, he heard scuffling, a cry of pain. He looked back to see Mr. James struggling with Red Bandana while the other 2 teens grabbed their few possessions. Leave him alone, Jordan shouted. He picked up a broken bottle and threw it. It shattered against the wall near Red Bandana's head. You little... Red Bandana turned, knife glinting. Mr. James tackled him. They both went down hard on the concrete. The other teens scattered, taking Jordan's backpack and Mr. James's coat with them. Mr. James... Jordan ran back. The old man wasn't moving. I told you to run, Mr. James groaned. He pushed himself up slowly, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. You're hurt. Jordan's voice shook. We need to get help. What we need, Mr. James said, is to find a new spot. He tried to stand but stumbled, catching himself against the wall. This is stupid. Jordan burst out. You need a doctor. You're sick and hurt, and I'm not worth all this. Not worth it. Mr. James's voice was sharp despite his weakness. Who told you that? Nobody had to tell me. Look at us. Jordan gestured wildly at the alley, the stolen belongings, the blood on Mr. James's face. I'm just some kid nobody wants. My own parents didn't even want me. Listen to me. Mr. James gripped Jordan's shoulders. I had a daughter, Sarah. She was about your age when... His voice caught. When the accident happened, I thought I'd never teach again, never care about anything again. But then I saw you, trying so hard to survive out here alone. You reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place. To teach math. Jordan asked, confused. To help children realize their worth. Another cough shook Mr. James's frame. Every child deserves to know they matter. But I don't. You do. Mr. James's grip tightened. You're smart, Jordan. You're resilient. You're kind, even after everything you've been through. Those are rare qualities. Precious ones. Jordan's eyes burned. Then why did they leave me? Because they couldn't see what I see. Mr. James swayed slightly. Sometimes people are too wrapped up in their own pain to recognize the treasure right in front of them. A police siren wailed in the distance. Jordan tensed, ready to run, but Mr. James could barely stand. Go, Mr. James said. Save yourself. Jordan looked at the mouth of the alley, then back at Mr. James's pale face. He thought about all the times he'd run, all the times he'd been alone. No. Jordan ducked under Mr. James's arm, supporting some of his weight. We'll find a new spot together. They limped slowly out of the alley, Mr. James leaning heavily on Jordan's shoulder. The November wind cut through their thin clothes, and Mr. James's cough seemed to get worse with every block. We should stop, Jordan said as Mr. James stumbled again. Just need to rest a moment. Mr. James slid down the wall of a bus stop, his breathing labored. Jordan watched helplessly as the man who had become his teacher, his protector, his only friend in this harsh world, struggled for air. The decision crystallized in his mind. I'm going to find help, he said. Real help. Please, please just stay here. Jordan, wait. But Jordan was already running, tears blurring his vision. He had to find someone, had to make them listen, had to make them understand that Mr. James wasn't just another homeless man on the streets. He was the only person who had seen Jordan's worth, and Jordan wasn't going to let him die in an alley. Jordan's lungs burned as he sprinted through the morning crowd. The sidewalks were filling with people heading to work, but none of them seemed to notice the panicked boy weaving between them. Help, he called out. Please, somebody. A woman clutched her purse closer. A man in a suit stepped aside, avoiding eye contact. Jordan's desperation grew with each rejection. He rounded a corner and crashed into someone. Books scattered across the sidewalk. I'm sorry. Jordan scrambled to help pick up the books. I'm sorry, but please, my friend is sick. He needs help. Slow down. The woman knelt beside him. She wore a neat blazer and glasses, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. A teacher's ID badge from Bronx Science High School hung around her neck. What friend? Mr. James? Jordan's voice cracked. He's by the bus stop. He's really sick, and some guys hurt him, and... Take me to him. Jordan blinked, surprised by her immediate response. Really? Really? She gathered her books quickly. I'm Miss Thompson. Where is he? Jordan led her back through the streets, praying Mr. James would still be there. His heart nearly stopped when he saw the empty bus stop. No, no, no. He spun in a circle. He was right here. A weak cough drew their attention to the narrow gap between buildings. Mr. James lay crumpled against the wall, his breathing shallow. Sir? Miss Thompson knelt beside him, pressing a hand to his forehead. Can you hear me? Mr. James's eyes fluttered open. Jordan shouldn't have run off. I got help, Jordan said, dropping to his knees. She's a teacher, like you were. Miss Thompson's eyebrows rose, but she focused on checking Mr. James's pulse. We need to call an ambulance. No. Mr. James tried to push her hand away. Can't afford. I'm calling anyway. She pulled out her phone. You have a fever and possible head trauma. This isn't optional. Jordan watched helplessly as she dialed 911. The operator's questions seemed endless. They're sending someone, Miss Thompson said finally. Jordan, why don't you tell me how you know Mr. James? But Jordan had already backed away. The reality of what he'd done hit him. He'd brought an authority figure, someone who would ask questions, who would find out he was homeless, who would send him away. I have to go, he whispered. Jordan, wait. He ran. Behind him, he heard sirens approaching. Tears blurred his vision as he darted through alleys, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and the consequences of his actions. He ended up in a small park, hiding behind a maintenance shed. His chest ached, but not from running. He'd abandoned Mr. James, just like his parents had abandoned him. I'm sorry, he whispered to no one. I'm so sorry. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, then began to sink. Jordan's stomach growled, but he ignored it. He couldn't stop seeing Mr. James's pale face, hearing his labored breathing. This is stupid, he muttered finally. This is exactly what he said not to do. The walk back seemed to take forever. When he finally reached the bus stop, it was empty. No ambulance, no Mr. James, no Miss Thompson. Looking for someone? Jordan spun around. Miss Thompson sat on the bus stop bench, a paper cup of coffee in her hands. I thought you might come back, she said. Sit. Jordan hesitated, then sat at the far end of the bench. Is he okay? They took him to Mount Sinai Hospital. She took a sip of coffee. He has pneumonia and a mild concussion. But he refused treatment until I promised to wait here for you. Fresh tears stung Jordan's eyes. He did? He said you'd come back. She studied him over her glasses. He also said you're excellent at math. When you believe in yourself. Jordan stared at the ground. He was just being nice. According to his medical records, he was a professor of mathematics at Columbia University for 20 years. Miss Thompson's voice was gentle. I don't think he was just being nice. Jordan's head snapped up. You mean he was telling the truth? About that and many other things, I suspect. She set her coffee aside. Jordan, he told me you're homeless. That your parents left. Jordan tensed, ready to run again. I'm not here to hurt you, she said quickly. I'm here to help. There are programs, people who can... No. Jordan stood. They'll just send me away. Put me in some home where nobody cares, where I can't see Mr. James anymore. Is that what you're afraid of? I'm not afraid. But his voice shook. He's the only person who sees you, Miss Thompson finished softly. Who believes in you? Jordan nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. What if I told you there's a way you could stay near him? Get a Rayal bed, regular meals, and still continue your lessons? How? I have a friend at social services. She specializes in cases like yours. Miss Thompson pulled out a business card. She could help find you a foster family in this district. You could visit Mr. James at the hospital. Maybe even have him tutor you properly once he recovers. Jordan stared at the card. Hope and fear warred in his chest. He's asking for you, Miss Thompson added quietly. He's worried. Jordan's fingers closed around the card. Can we go see him now? Of course. She stood, gathering her things. The hospital's about 10 blocks from here. They walked in silence for a few minutes before Jordan spoke again. Miss Thompson? Yes. What's pneumonia? Exactly. She launched into an explanation of lung inflammation and infection, her teacher's instincts taking over. Jordan listened intently, asking questions, his mind already working on ways to help Mr. James recover. Maybe he thought there were still some adults worth trusting after all. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and stale air. Jordan stood in the doorway, his heart pounding at the sight of Mr. James connected to beeping machines. An oxygen mask covered his face, and his skin looked almost as white as his beard. Go on, Miss Thompson urged gently from behind him. He's awake. Jordan took small steps into the room. Mr. James's eyes opened at the sound, and relief flooded his tired face. Jordan, he whispered through the mask. You came back. I'm sorry I ran. Jordan's voice cracked. I was scared and stupid, and Mr. James lifted a shaking hand. Jordan rushed forward to take it. Not stupid, Mr. James said. Never stupid. A nurse entered, checking the monitors. 5 minutes, she warned. He needs rest. Jordan nodded, but didn't let go of Mr. James's hand. Are you going to be okay? Just need some time. Mr. James's voice was weak. The doctors say, I've been stubborn. Should have come sooner, like when you first got sick. Jordan asked, before those guys hurt you? Mr. James tried to smile. Teaching you was more important. No, it wasn't. Jordan's outburst made the nurse look up sharply. He lowered his voice. Nothing's more important than you getting better. Everything's more important than me. Mr. James's eyes drifted closed. Lost so much time after Sarah died. Sarah? Jordan looked at Ms. Thompson, who stood quietly by the door. His daughter, she explained softly. I looked up his records. She and his wife died in a car accident 12 years ago. He resigned from Columbia shortly after. But Jordan frowned. You were a real professor? With an office and everything? Mr. James nodded slightly. Had it all once. Family, career, respect. His voice grew distant. Lost myself. When I lost them, the nurse stepped forward. He needs to rest now. Wait. Jordan tightened his grip on Mr. James's hand. I'll come back tomorrow. I promise. And I'll bring your chalk. And we can do more math when you're better. Okay. Mr. James's eyes opened again, focusing on Jordan with sudden clarity. You have a chance now. Real home, real school. What do you mean? Miss Thompson told me about her friend. Each word seemed to cost him effort. Social services can help. Jordan's stomach clenched. No, I want to stay with you. Jordan? Mr. James squeezed his hand weakly. I can't take care of you, not like this. But please. Mr. James's eyes were bright with tears. Let them help. Where I couldn't. The nurse touched Jordan's shoulder. Time to go, honey. Jordan looked at Mr. James's pale face, the oxygen mask, the 4 lines. His chest felt tight, like he might explode or collapse. I'll come back, he repeated fiercely. Every day. I promise. Outside the room, Jordan leaned against the wall, trying to breathe normally. Ms. Thompson waited patiently. Did you know, he asked finally, about him being a professor? I suspected there was more to his story, she said. The way he talks, his knowledge of mathematics. But I didn't know the details until the hospital found his records. Jordan slid down the wall until he sat on the floor. All this time, he was somebody important, and he lived on the streets just to teach me stupid math problems. Math wasn't what he was teaching you, Jordan. He looked up at her. What do you mean? He was teaching you your own worth. Miss Thompson sat beside him. Sometimes we need someone else to believe in us before we can believe in ourselves. Jordan pulled his knees to his chest. What happens now? That depends on you. She pulled out her phone. I can call my friend at social services. Start the process of finding you a safe place to stay. Or what? Or you can go back to the streets. Try to survive on your own. Her voice was gentle but firm. But I don't think that's what Mr. James wants for you. Do you? Jordan thought about the past weeks. The cold nights, the constant hunger, the fear, but also the chalk scratching on concrete, Mr. James's patient voice explaining fractions, the way he made Jordan feel like he mattered. Will, his voice caught. Will they let me visit him? I'll make sure of it personally. Jordan took a deep breath. Okay, call your friend. Miss Thompson dialed the number. As she spoke quietly into the phone, Jordan stared at the closed door of Mr. James's room. Through the small window, he could see the old man sleeping, his chest rising and falling steadily. Thank you, Jordan whispered. For everything. A social worker arrived an hour later. She had kind eyes and spoke to Jordan like he was a person, not a problem to solve. She explained about emergency foster homes, about his rights, about the process ahead. Jordan listened, answered questions, signed papers. But his mind kept going back to the chalk drawings on concrete, to multiplication tables practiced in alleyways, to an old man who gave up everything just to teach one lost boy that he mattered. As they left the hospital, Jordan looked back one last time. He'll be here tomorrow, Miss Thompson assured him. And the day after that. You can visit him as much as you want. Jordan nodded, squaring his shoulders. Mr. James had given up everything to teach him. Now it was his turn to learn the hardest lesson. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone help you. The bedroom was too quiet. Jordan lay on the real bed, his bed now, according to Mrs. Chun, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling. The sheets were clean and soft. The room was warm. Everything was perfect. He hated it. Jordan? Mrs. Chen's voice came through the door. Dinner's ready if you're hungry. Okay. He called back but didn't move. The Chens were nice enough. They'd taken him in as an emergency placement, showing him around their modest apartment with genuine warmth. Mr. Chun had even cracked jokes while helping Jordan put away the few clothes the social worker had bought him. But it wasn't right. None of it was right. Jordan rolled over, pressing his face into the pillow. It smelled like laundry detergent, not like the city air he'd gotten used to. Not like the chalk dust that always seemed to cling to Mr. James's coat. Mr. James. The thought made Jordan's chest tight. He hadn't been allowed to visit the hospital today. Too many forms to fill out, meetings with social workers, getting settled with the Chens. Tomorrow, they'd promised. Tomorrow he could go. If Mr. James was still there. A knock on the door made him jump. Jordan? Mrs. Chen again. There's someone here to see you. He sat up, heart pounding. But it wasn't Mr. James in the doorway. It was Miss Thompson, holding a manila envelope. Special delivery, she said, stepping into the room. From a certain patient at Mount Sinai. Jordan scrambled off the bed. Miss Thompson handed him the envelope, and his hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a letter, written in the same neat handwriting he'd seen in chalk on concrete. Dear Jordan, the nurses finally gave me some paper and a pen. Much easier than chalk, though not nearly as interesting. I hear you're with a foster family now. Good. You deserve a real bed, regular meals, and people who can care for you properly. I know it's scary. Change always is. But you're the bravest person I know. Remember when you couldn't solve that division problem? You kept trying even when it seemed impossible. That's who you are, Jordan. Someone who doesn't give up. The doctors say I'll be here a while longer. Apparently, living on the streets with pneumonia wasn't my smartest decision. But they also say I'm improving. Thanks to you. If you hadn't brought help that day. But that's not why I'm writing. I have a favor to ask. The hospital social worker found my old colleagues at Columbia. They want to help me get back on my feet. Maybe even teach again, properly this time. So here's my favor. Keep learning. Keep growing. Show the world what I already know, that you're capable of amazing things. I'll be here when you want to visit. We can still do math, though maybe not on concrete anymore. Your friend and teacher, James Wilson, Ph.D. Still just Mr. James to you. Jordan read the letter 3 times before looking up. Ms. Thompson waited patiently. He's really going to be okay? Jordan's voice was small. The doctors are very optimistic. She sat on the edge of the bed. And his former department head at Columbia is arranging for his medical bills to be covered. But what about after? Where will he live? The university has visiting professor housing. Ms. Thompson smiled. Apparently, they never filled his position. The math department chair always hoped he'd come back. Jordan traced the signature on the letter. He signed it Ph.D., Doctor of Philosophy in Mathematics. Ms. Thompson nodded. He was quite renowned in his field before his family died. Jordan swallowed hard, and he ended up on the streets. Like me. Jordan? Ms. Thompson leaned forward. You know that's not going to happen to you, right? We won't let it. But what if the Chins don't want me? What if I mess up? What if? A soft knock interrupted him. Mrs. Chun stood in the doorway, holding a steaming bowl. I thought you might prefer to eat in here tonight, she said. It's chicken congee, rice porridge. My mother always made it for me when I was scared or sad. The simple kindness in her voice made Jordan's eyes burn. She set the bowl on the bedside table and turned to go. Mrs. Chun? Jordan called after her. Could you stay? Maybe tell me about your mother's congee. Her face lit up. Of course. You know, she had a secret ingredient. As Mrs. Chun settled into the room's small chair, Ms. Thompson stood. I should go, she said. But I'll pick you up tomorrow after school to visit Mr. James. The Chins already approved it. Jordan clutched the letter. Thank you. For everything. After Ms. Thompson left, Jordan listened to Mrs. Chin's stories about growing up in Taiwan, about learning to cook from her mother, about moving to New York with nothing but hope and determination. The congee was warm and comforting, settling his stomach and something deeper inside him. That night, lying in his new bed, Jordan reread Mr. James's letter until the words blurred. Outside his window, the city lights glowed against the dark sky. Somewhere out, there was the alley where they'd first done math problems, the bus stop, where everything had changed. The hospital where Mr. James was getting better. For the first time in weeks, Jordan slept through the night. He dreamed of chalk dust and equations, of warm congee and gentle voices, of a future that didn't seem quite so impossible anymore. When morning came, he was ready to try. 2 weeks passed in a blur of new routines. Wake up in a real bed. Eat breakfast with the Chins. Go to school. Try not to fall too far behind. Visit Mr. James. Do homework. Have dinner. Sleep. Repeat. Jordan stood outside room 412, hesitating. Usually, Miss Thompson came with him for these visits, but today she had a faculty meeting. The Chins had dropped him off, trusting him to find his way. He could hear voices inside the room. One was Mr. James, stronger now without the oxygen mask. The other was unfamiliar. James, you can't just throw away this opportunity, the stranger was saying. The department needs you. The students need you. Richard, I appreciate the offer, but Jordan knocked on the doorframe. Both men turned to look at him. Jordan? Mr. James's face lit up. Come in, come in. I want you to meet someone. The stranger was tall and well-dressed, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked at Jordan with curious eyes. This is Dr. Richard Martinez, head of mathematics at Columbia, Mr. James said. Richard, this is the young man I was telling you about. Ah, the prodigy? Dr. Martinez smiled. James says you have quite a talent for numbers. Jordan shuffled his feet. He's just being nice. Show him, Mr. James said. The test you got back today. Jordan hesitated, then pulled a folded paper from his backpack. It was his first math test at the new school, 98%. Dr. Martinez examined the test, his eyebrows rising. Impressive, especially considering I was homeless? Jordan's voice had an edge. Jordan, Mr. James said softly. No, he's right. Dr. Martinez handed the test back. I apologize. I was going to say, considering the disruption to your education, but that's not really accurate, is it? You had an excellent teacher. Mr. James coughed, embarrassed. Speaking of which, I believe we have some algebra to review. Actually, Dr. Martinez picked up his briefcase. I have a proposition for both of you. Jordan sat in the chair by Mr. James's bed, curious despite himself. James, what if your return to teaching included a special student? Dr. Martinez looked at Jordan. We could arrange something through our community outreach program. Private tutoring, advanced placement preparation. I don't know. Jordan looked at Mr. James. I'm still catching up at regular school. Jordan? Mr. James's voice was serious. What's 7 times 8? 56. Square root of 144. 12. Solve for x. 3x plus 7 equals 22. 5. Mr. James smiled at Dr. Martinez. Did he pause to calculate any of those? No, Dr. Martinez admitted. He didn't. That's raw talent. Mr. James turned back to Jordan. Talent that deserves to be nurtured. Jordan stared at his hands. But what if I fail? What did I tell you about failure? Mr. James asked. It's just another step toward understanding, Jordan recited. Then he grinned. You wrote that in chalk like 50 times, and I'll write it 50 more if that's what it takes. Mr. James looked at Dr. Martinez. But only if Jordan wants to. Think about it, Dr. Martinez said, heading for the door. No pressure. Just possibility. After he left, Jordan pulled out his current math homework. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds being pencil on paper and the quiet beeping of monitors. Your color's better, Jordan said eventually. The doctors say I might be released next week. Mr. James circled an error in Jordan's work. Try that one again. Jordan rewrote the equation. Where will you go? The university has temporary housing arranged. Mr. James watched him work. Not far from your new school, actually. Really? Jordan looked up hopefully. Really? Mr. James smiled. The Chins told me you're doing well there. Jordan shrugged. It's okay. Mrs. Chun packs good lunches. And Mr. Chun helps me with science homework. They seem like good people. They are. Jordan erased a number 2 hard, tearing the paper slightly. Just what? I keep waiting for them to change their minds. The words tumbled out. To decide I'm too much trouble, or too expensive, or to me. Jordan, Mr. James waited until the boy met his eyes. Do you know what Mrs. Chen asked me when she visited yesterday? Jordan shook his head. She asked for your favorite foods. She wants to learn to cook them. Mr. James's voice was gentle. And Mr. Chen asked about your interests, so he could look for after-school activities you might enjoy. But Jordan's throat felt tight. But why? Because they care. Not about who you were or what happened to you, but about who you are and who you could become, like you did. Jordan's voice was barely a whisper. Like I do, Mr. James corrected. Present tense. Jordan tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he turned back to his homework, blinking hard. Now, Mr. James said after a moment, about that equation, they worked until visiting hours ended. As Jordan packed up his books, a nurse brought in Mr. James's dinner tray. See you tomorrow? Jordan asked. Actually, Mr. James picked at his hospital food. The doctors want to run some tests tomorrow. But what about Saturday? The Chins could bring you to the university. We could look at the mathematics department, maybe sit in on a class. Jordan thought about Dr. Martinez's offer, about possibilities, about futures he'd never dared imagine. Yeah, he said, I'd like that. On the bus ride home, Jordan watched the city lights blur past the window. His backpack held a perfect math test, half-finished homework, and the promise of something new, something challenging, something his. The Chins were waiting when he got home, the apartment warm and smelling of dinner. Mrs. Chen asked about his visit while Mr. Chun set the table. They didn't push when he gave short answers, just included him in their gentle conversation. Later, doing his evening reading for English class, Jordan realized something. The room didn't feel too quiet anymore. The bed didn't feel too strange. The kindness didn't feel too fragile. It felt like healing, like hope, like home. The courthouse hallway was too bright, too clean, too official. Jordan pulled at his new tie, a gift from Mr. Chen, and tried not to fidget in the uncomfortable wooden bench. Stop fussing, Mrs. Chen said gently, straightening his collar. You look very handsome. Indeed he does. Mr. James walked toward them, leaning slightly on a cane, but otherwise looking like a different person from the man Jordan had met in that alley 3 months ago. His beard was neatly trimmed, his suit pressed, his eyes clear and bright. "Mr. James!" Jordan jumped up. "You came." "Of course I came." Mr. James sat beside him. "I wouldn't miss this day for anything." Today was adoption day. After 3 months with the Chins, countless meetings with social workers, and more paperwork than Jordan thought possible, it was finally happening. He was going to have a family again. "Jordan?" The social worker appeared in the hallway. "The judge is ready to see you." His legs felt wobbly as he stood. Mrs. Chun squeezed his hand, and Mr. Chun put a steady hand on his shoulder. "Wait." Jordan turned to Mr. James. "Will you come in too? Please." The judge was a kind-faced woman who spoke directly to Jordan, not just to the adults. She asked him if he understood what adoption meant, if he wanted the Chins to be his parents, if he was sure about changing his name to Jordan Chun. "Yes," he answered each time, his voice getting stronger. "Yes, I'm sure." When she signed the final paper, everyone clapped. Mrs. Chun, "Mom now," he reminded himself, wiped tears from her eyes. Mr. Chun, "Dad," hugged him tightly. "There's one more surprise," Mom said as they left the courthouse. At the university, they drove to Columbia, where Mr. James had officially resumed teaching 2 weeks ago. The mathematics building looked huge and intimidating, but Jordan knew his way to Mr. James's office now. He'd been coming twice a week for advanced tutoring, preparing for the special academic program he'd start next semester. But today, they went to a different room, a classroom filled with people. Surprise! Ms. Thompson was there, along with Dr. Martinez and several other professors. A banner read, "Congratulations, Jordan Chun." "What?" Jordan stared at the crowd. "Well," Mr. James said, "we couldn't let such a big day pass without a proper celebration." On a table were cards and gifts, and a cake decorated with mathematical symbols. Jordan laughed when he saw the pie symbol made of frosting. And Dr. Martinez stepped forward. "We have an announcement. The university is establishing a new scholarship program for underprivileged students showing exceptional mathematical ability. It will cover enrichment programs, tutoring, and eventually college expenses." He handed Jordan an official-looking certificate. "Congratulations to our first recipient." Jordan read the scholarship's name, and his breath caught. "The Sarah Wilson Memorial Scholarship?" Mr. James's eyes glistened. Sarah loved math too. She would have liked this. The party was a blur of congratulations and cake. Jordan met professors who would teach him next semester, saw the classrooms where he'd study, heard about possibilities that made his head spin. Later, as people were leaving, Mr. James pulled him aside. "I have something for you." He handed Jordan a small box. Inside was a piece of chalk, worn and familiar. Jordan recognized it immediately, the same piece they'd used for their first lesson in the alley. "To remind you," Mr. James said, "that education can happen anywhere. That worth isn't determined by circumstance. That sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures." Jordan clutched the chalk. "I would have died out there without you." "No." Mr. James gripped his shoulder. "You would have survived because that's who you are. But now you get to do more than survive. You get to thrive." Someone called Jordan's name. His parents, his real parents now, legally and in his heart, were waiting by the door. "Ready to go home?" Dad asked. "Almost." Jordan turned back to Mr. James. "See you Tuesday for tutoring?" "Of course." Mr. James smiled. "We're starting calculus next. Think you can handle it?" "Please." Jordan grinned. "I learned math on concrete in the middle of winter. Calculus doesn't scare me." As they drove home, Jordan held the chalk in his pocket. He thought about the alley where this all began, about the cold nights and empty stomach and desperate loneliness. But those memories didn't hurt like they used to, because now he had a warm bed in a room decorated with math posters, a desk where he could study without worrying about rain or gangs or hunger, parents who asked about his day and meant it, a teacher who saw past his circumstances to his potential. The car stopped at a red light. Through the window, Jordan saw a teenage boy huddled in a doorway, trying to stay warm. Without hesitation, he rolled down his window. "Hey," he called out. The boy looked up, wary. "There's a shelter 3 blocks that way. Ask for Maria. Tell her Jordan Chun sent you. They'll help." The light turned green. As they drove away, Jordan saw the boy stand up, looking in the direction he'd pointed. "That was kind of you," Mom said softly. "Someone once helped me," Jordan replied. "Taught me I was worth helping." He touched the chalk in his pocket again. Tomorrow, he'd help his dad with his accounting work, using the skills Mr. James had taught him. He'd eat his mom's dumplings and tell her about his day. He'd do his homework at his desk, in his room, in his home. And next week, he'd start calculus with Mr. James. Both of them exactly where they were meant to be. Not a homeless man and a lost boy anymore, but a respected professor and his most promising student. The equation of his life had balanced out after all. Different variables than he'd expected. But the solution was beautiful in its simplicity. Family. Education. Purpose. Home. Sometimes, Jordan realized, the hardest problems had the simplest answers. You just needed someone to help you solve them.